Welcome back to the Star Trek Critic, where each episode is graded like a school project, starting with 100 points, taking 1 point away for each error, and we see what's left. And I make snarky commentary along the way. Also, still photos are used extensively to prevent copyright claims, because copyright claims suck. And today's episode is one of my personal favorites, Half a Life, where they made a race who ends their lives at 60 years old, no matter what. It looks like someone forgot that a Betazoid is telepathic and will know where he is. It turns out Jean-Luc is a delicious man. Then he turns down a sure thing. And you know what that means? It means he's got a girl on the side somewhere. For me personally, if you take out the first season episode, Haven, all the shows with Mrs. Troy are among the best. They're truly exceptional. The first point is lost since Mrs. Troy is hitching a ride on the Enterprise, meaning Betazed is close enough to Kaylon 2 to at least know about a Class M planet with a dying star. After all, she is a planetary ambassador. She would know more about their neighbors than the average Betazoid. I disagree with Picard here. He should have invited Mrs. Troy, a planetary diplomat, to help with his first contact situation, so I am going to take another point. Another point lost here. Timothy would not show up alone with such an important mission. I don't know what's going on right here, but that is not Lieutenant Commander LaForge. 1 point lost here. They never shake hands before, and they never do it again. If Picard had given Mrs. Troy a Kaylon 2 briefing beforehand like he should have, she wouldn't have been so forward with him, now would she? Picard's hands are folded, now they're at his side, so minus 1 point. Mrs. Troy is correct here. They should make him feel more comfortable on the ship. Of course, she has other things in mind. And she's saying, Timothy, look, and extra always crosses when we open the doors. Check that out. They're like, yep, he's getting laid tonight. The Kaylons are xenophobic, so they're a little hesitant to ask for help with their dying son. They've probably known for a century, but doesn't this happen like 10 years later with the Romulans? The next point is lost, since it would be impossible for anyone in space to mess with a star like they're going to do. The permits to do this would be crazy. If this star explodes, it's going to mess up all the other stars and planets, no matter how far away it is. This is foreshadowing. Dr. Timothy wants to go out with a bang. While on the bridge, Worf says, Mrs. Troy, I'd like your permission to court your daughter. Mrs. Troy sees the love of her life, but it turns out it's not Deanna this time. Deanna says, Mother, what do you want? And Mrs. Troy says, why, the second baseman, of course. Then she says she can't see the left fielder. 1 point lost for Deanna in a cat suit. 1 point lost for the turbolift doors opening too soon. Timothy's like, damn, your mom's a hottie. And Deanna says, well, you can have her. Then he insults Deanna by saying, I thought you two were sisters. Mrs. Troy may be strange, but she knows not to set up a picnic lunch in the engineering table, so minus 1 point. Now, I'm not sure, but I believe the temperature that they're talking about is almost 10 times the temperature of our sun. Timothy says, I've made some perfectly marvelous Montigian pate. Then Mrs. Troy says, that's odd, so have I. Data decides to mansplain, and Geordi says, dude, you need to shut up. She tells you how to say her name correctly. I can't actually get it right.
You call me Luoxana.
Minus 1 point for a single set of doors on the turbolift. Here is where she says the Enterprise was nearby, so she hitched a ride, which means Kaylon 2 isn't that far away from Betazed. One thing you don't learn is how Timothy's wife died. Was she older than him, or did she get killed in a car accident? You never find out. Here is the irony of Kaylon 2. Their star is dying. The people of the planet are trying to keep the star alive, but have no concern about the welfare of the senior citizens on their planet and have them commit suicide before they get to the point where they need medical care. But the star is more important. Mrs. Troy invites him in for a nightcap. Timothy turns her down. She says, oh, I know about that little problem. That's why I always bring Viagra in case of emergencies. But he still turns her down, saying, not until the third date. He's a gentleman, but they better have that third date before his next birthday. According to the Startate, about 16 hours have passed, which is not enough time to prepare for their test, so minus 1 more point. Deanna says, Mother, how much have you had to drink? Here you learn Betazeds can't read Kaylon's minds, which is why she doesn't know he's going to kill himself in a few days. There go the probes, and they are not big enough to have a shield that keeps them from melting in the star, so minus 1 more point. Also, it should be 170 million kelvins, not degrees Kelvin, so minus 1 point. Data says 230 million, so minus 1 point. You don't use the word and when counting. Even Geordi knew that this time. Humans make that mistake all the time, but an android would not.
137. 170 million degrees Kelvin.
230 million degrees Kelvin.
The android also said degrees Kelvin too, didn't he? So, minus 1 more point. To make a long story short, the test failed and they destroyed a star. Their neighbors are going to be really pissed right now. Timothy now has the realization that saving their star will not be put on his gravestone next week. Aww. Timothy sits alone in Tin Ford contemplating his last meal. Mrs. Troyan comes in and says, "Hey Timothy, it's third date night. You know what that means." Timothy is thinking, "Damn, I got a really hot new girlfriend just at the wrong time in my life, didn't I?" Look close, their improved graphics actually show clouds and an atmosphere on the planet. They are back at Kalon 2 in less than 2 days, which means they did not stay to study the star, so minus 1 point. They just destroyed the star and ran off like little kids throwing rocks at a window. This is a good shot of the three amigos, but who's flying the ship? This blue cloth in the corner is actually from Timothy's tunic, but Timothy's not in there right now, so minus 1 point. Picard says, "That was fun, let's go destroy more stars at the taxpayers' expense." But Bernadette says, "No thanks, we're xenophobic and eventually that will come back to haunt us. And please bring back Timothy for his funeral." And they're like, "Huh? What's that supposed to mean?" Mrs. Troy comes in and lets the boys know that the female ambassador figured out the planet's dirty little secret. Picard says, "Data, what do you know of this planet?" Data says, "As usual, we know nothing. This is just like when you sent a teenager to the orgy planet and they tried to kill him for falling into their weed planter." There have been several books and movies about ending lives early. Logan's Run is probably the most famous. In the book, the age was 21, while in the movie it was 30. Asimov's Pebble in the Sky and a Twilight Zone episode cover the same ground, and Anthony Trollope wrote about it in The Fixed Period in 1881. During the resolution, Timothy will be wined and dined.
69.
Not a bad way to go. Picard's like, "Well, shit, I got a problem now, don't I?" Did you ever feel that Picard is unusually unemotional right now? Loaxana says, "Jean-Luc, you have to go down there and tell them how to run their planet." Picard says, "You know the Prime Directive says we can't, since that's called imperialism." Mrs. Troy says, "Isn't that why you're here? Isn't that why you have Livingston the lionfish, the most invasive species on Earth, to remind us that's what Starfleet is all about?" Picard says, "No, I just got him because I thought he was a pretty fish." Loaxana says, "Jean-Luc, you are full of shit, since your whole goal in space is to steal ancient alien artifacts. And if it wasn't for colonization, the Aztecs and Mayans would still be executing 20,000 peasants a year to keep them in line, but nobody remembers that." She runs out and they're both thinking, "This is Deanna's problem, not ours." And what happened to Data? He was in there a minute ago. Mrs. Troy and O'Brien discuss their future on Deep Space Nine. O'Brien says, "Hey, did you know it is possible to keep people from transporting out on their own?" Of course, that's all they ever do on Star Trek. This is one of the best scenes in Star Trek, an excellent mother-daughter bonding scene about the loss of loved ones. And knowing that a few days from now Timothy is going to take his own life, of course I can't show it for copyright reasons, so please be sure to watch the whole episode. It's such a serious scene I can't even make a joke about the third baseman. This is incredible. Anytime a door opens, an extra in the background crosses by. Timothy says, "Oh good, you're here for date number 3, the do the nasty date." He says, "It's the way of my world." What a horrible pickup line. She says, "I never will, I never will." Then she says, "Screw it, let's do it, you big strong man." Timothy explains on his planet 2,000 years ago, they discovered just how much money they would save in Social Security and Medicare and old folks' homes if they just bumped them off at 60 in a big send-off. They really save a lot of taxpayer money that way. Mrs. Troy says, "You're full of shit." Then he tells her it's a time of transition because he's going to come back as Timosina. Mrs. Troy says, "We changed our kids' diapers, then it becomes their turn to change ours." Timothy says, "On our planet, the kids just toss the parents out to die." Here's where you learn Oscoids is spelled with a K and not a G like I always thought. Timothy checks out her butt and says, "Looks very interesting." Mrs. Troy says, "This makes no sense. If you die at 60, you have no right to talk since you married a 300-year-old girl just because she still looked like a teenager, which is really weird, you know. Then you dressed up like aardvarks, and look what happened to your kids. One son likes sticking Q-tips up his nose, the other one is only 10 and picks up trashy women, and then your daughter turned out to be the worst admiral in the colonial fleet. And then you pushed the Indians off their land to mine for gold, then became a doctor in a war, and many of them never made it to 60, and some never even made it to 20. Who do you think you are? Timothy says, you're right, that doesn't make sense at all. This was one of the best conversations in the entire 7 years of Star Trek, but the narrator can't play it due to copyright claims, so says stupid stuff instead, and still expects viewers to click the like button, the share button, and that subscribe button. Now you learn that the women of Beta said used to have beehive haircuts with caged animals in the middle of them. Now here comes the irony that the planet is more than willing to prolong the life of their dying star, but aren't interested in prolonging the life of their aging people. Then she asks, how was the sex? Timothy says, it was beautiful, let's do it again. Mrs. Troy says, where? Down in engineering, Timothy says, look here, I keep seeing this number, 4077. What does that mean? Now they argue about the migration of neutrons. That's racist. You'd think the planet would send a whole fleet of younger scientists to go with him to build on his work, but they don't. And he just needs a little bit more time. As usual, Picard is caught looking at online porn. Timothy says, you know, Picard, my planet does have a stupid policy and I want to hang around for a little while. Petardette says, there is no way you can stay. We totally solved the social security problem on the planet just by bumping off all the old people. You come back so we can turn you into little green squares. Petardette can't believe that a scientist like Timothy could actually make his own decisions. He says others will finish his work for him, but if that was true, they would have sent tons of scientists to help him out on the ship. And how did Timothy know that 2 warships were coming? Seriously, do they really think their little ships will do damage to the Enterprise? Timothy says, have I done the right thing? But Picard says, well, according to the Prime Directive, I'm not allowed to have an opinion. Timothy talks about how great Mrs. Troy is, and Picard is now thinking, oh hell yeah, you're staying here to keep her out of my hair. Just how much of their tax money is spent to threaten to bring him back? Beverly says, I only have 2 lines in this episode, so -1 point. Down in engineering, Timothy discovered he was cancelled by his own planet. Aww. This line is very prophetic. Mrs. Troy decides, Timothy, let's go do the nasty some more. Secretly, the entire crew's dancing in the hallways because he is keeping her very occupied. Mrs. Troy says, you're making a great statement, but Timothy says, only the first baseman's gonna hear it, and he's light years away. Another prophetic statement from Timothy. Like I said, this episode is really good. They did have the shields up a second ago, so they must have dropped them so she could beam through. Mrs. Troy's thinking, damn, your haircut's worse than that birdcage in the beehive thing. Dara says, Father, come home and kill yourself so I can collect your inheritance. She has really crappy social skills, doesn't she? Poor Mrs. Troy, she tries so hard, but it's like just talking to a brick wall. Dara goes off on her. There's gonna be a cat fight soon. They're really just ground into this ritual. All he really wants to do is live a little bit longer so he can try his experiment one more time. Mrs. Troy is so upset she goes to her own daughter for counseling. Look close, there's a boom mic in the reflection, so -1 point, and then there's a shadow of the boom mic, so -1 more point. It happened again. The door opened and an extra walks down the hallway. And again, this is another excellent conversation. So please watch the actual show. I can't show the video because of copyright claims. Deanna leaves so they can do the nasty one last time. Timothy may not be leading the revolt, but will probably spark protesters in support of change. But it's too late. But the star will go nova and the planet will explode and they will all die, since they are self-centered xenophobes that would rather go out with a bang than ask for help. Even the Romulans ask for help. Picard has an awkward moment pretending this is all normal, and the way Timothy talks about contacting them again sounds like he's going to be around a while longer. Then he says, would you like to wait a moment to say goodbye to Mrs. Troy? Then Timothy says, no, we really did each other last night and she's still recovering. I'm really good at it. Mrs. Troy comes in and asks to go down as a friend. Plus, as an ambassador, she will really smooth out a lot of those problems. Then the two of them beam down together. Timothy has his resolution ceremony, then he dies, then he turns into green squares, and then they eat him. Terrence McNally was on Mork and Mindy, Looker, and The Greatest American Hero. For a short time, he was married to Julie Brown. Carol Struycken is 7 feet tall and was on the Addams Family. Michelle Forbes was on The Guiding Light and 24, and of course, will be back soon as Ensign Rowe. The late Majel Barrett will be with us several more times here and on DS9, and those are some of their best episodes. David Ogden Stiers had an incredible career, starting with 7 years with the Santa Clara Shakespeare Festival, where he played King Lear and Richard III, conducted 70 orchestras with 100 appearances, and he really can play the French horn. He has a whopping 172 screen credits along with MASH, THX 1138, Charlie's Angels, and tons of Disney voices. He was 49 in Half a Life and left us at the age of 75. Half a Life is an excellent example of what science fiction is supposed to be, with controversial issues set in the future. This is why Star Trek is so important to us, and it gets a score of 80. Thanks for viewing. Be sure to leave comments below, click that like button, the share button, the subscribe button, and stay tuned for next week's episode.
He's just going to die. And for no good reason.